Imagine you're the mayor of a city. A major international sports organization comes to you and says, "We want to bring the World Cup here. It will be the biggest sporting event in the history of your city. Hundreds of thousands of visitors, global television exposure, an economic boost the likes of which your city may not see again in a generation." You say yes. Of course you say yes. And then the contracts arrive, the actual documents, written by FIFA's lawyers. Hundreds of pages of obligations, requirements, and concessions that your city, not FIFA, will be responsible for meeting. And you start reading. Free transit for all ticket holders, labor law exemptions for FIFA's preferred contractors, a ban on competing concerts or major sporting events across your entire city for weeks, VIP access to hospitals for FIFA officials and delegates. They asked for preferred procurement status for FIFA's corporate partners in local tenders. They asked for extensive tax exemptions on FIFA's commercial activities. In Toronto and Vancouver, these requests ran into something FIFA hadn't fully anticipated: Canadian law. In many cases, the concessions FIFA requested weren't just politically awkward, they were legally impossible without legislative changes that no Canadian government was going to rush through for a football tournament. So, FIFA backed down. The Globe and Mail reported on May 26th that FIFA has softened its stance on all of those asks in both Canadian host cities, retreating from demands that clashed with local laws after cities pushed back. The free transit requirement, the one that had been promised to fans in FIFA's original hosting documentation, the one that was in the bid that won the tournament, was quietly removed. Vancouver and Toronto both confirmed they would provide free transit only to volunteers, not to ticket holders. The fan festival terms were renegotiated to give cities more flexibility. The blackout periods for competing events remained, but other demands were reduced.
What this tells you is significant. FIFA is an organization that presents its contracts as largely non-negotiable. That's the reputation, and historically it's been accurate. Cities that want the World Cup sign what they're given, because there's always another city willing to sign it. That's the leverage model. It worked for decades. It worked well enough that FIFA was comfortable putting hospital VIP access and labor law exemptions in the same document. But in 2026, something shifted. Over a dozen cities dropped out of the bidding process for this tournament. Los Angeles publicly expressed frustration about the negotiations. Chicago and Pittsburgh both refused to sign hosting agreements for the 2031 Women's World Cup, citing exactly the kind of demands that appeared in the 2026 documents. The prevailing sentiment among municipalities, as one expert cited in the Globe analysis put it, was that FIFA's terms were too demanding, given that FIFA is the primary financial beneficiary of the event. That shift in attitude among host cities, a growing unwillingness to absorb one-sided agreements that generate enormous profit for FIFA while leaving cities holding costs they didn't fully anticipate, is one of the most consequential developments in the governance of international football. It's not dramatic. It doesn't happen at a press conference or in a stadium. It happens in lawyers' offices, in municipal council chambers, in budget documents. But it's changing the relationship between football's governing body and the cities it depends on. Now let's look at what the contracts actually create in practice, because the consequences of some of these terms for the cities involved have been genuinely disruptive. In Toronto, major events cannot be held from June 11th to July 3rd, with only 5 non-consecutive days exempted that don't conflict with World Cup matches. In Vancouver, the blackout period runs from June 12th to July 8th, with 7 non-consecutive days exempted. These are weeks of the summer season, the most commercially important weeks for entertainment, hospitality, and tourism businesses that have nothing to do with football. The Concord Pacific Dragon Boat Festival, which has been part of Vancouver's summer for 40 years, is being held in August this year instead of its traditional June dates. The only dock suitable for the event sits directly adjacent to BC Place, the World Cup venue, in a zone FIFA is contractually entitled to control. The Vancouver International Jazz Festival worked with the city for 2 years to secure permission to go ahead. Organizers moved their dates to align with the World Cup schedule. Some artists they wanted to book were unavailable as a result. The festival's executive directors said that larger acts had chosen to bypass Vancouver entirely this year to avoid potential conflicts with FIFA. These are not abstract complaints, they're the real-world consequences of contracts that prioritize FIFA's commercial environment over the existing cultural and economic life of the cities hosting the tournament. A 40-year community festival moved to August, a jazz festival losing headliners because Vancouver has become, for a month, FIFA's territory as much as the city's own. The financial picture adds another dimension. All 3 levels of Canadian government have already spent hundreds of millions of dollars preparing for this tournament. Toronto's FIFA World Cup Secretariat revealed in late May that only 4 host city supporter sponsorship packages had been sold, with days remaining before the tournament began, leaving the city's commercial team still working to close budget gaps that should have been closed months ago. An estimated $800,000 was added to Toronto's costs when FIFA requested up to 50 paramedics on hand at each match to respond to player injuries or spectator medical incidents. The Globe and Mail's description of the contract structure is worth quoting carefully. FIFA controls the competition and harvests most of the revenue. Governments assume most of the cost and practical risk. That's the deal. Not a corrupt deal, not an illegal deal. The cities knew what they were signing, broadly speaking. But in the moment of signing, the promises around economic benefit were vivid and the liabilities in the fine print were not. This situation is not unique to Canada, it's the pattern. New Jersey saw FIFA contribute $0 to a $48 million security and transport cost. Philadelphia had 2,000 hotel room reservations canceled by FIFA at short notice. Kansas City built its planning around projected visitor numbers that haven't materialized, and across all 11 American host cities, 80% of hotel operators are reporting booking levels below their initial forecasts, according to the American Hotel and Lodging Association's formal survey published on May 4th.
The question that all of this raises is one that the football world has been circling for years without quite landing on. What does FIFA owe to the places it uses? The organization generates billions from these tournaments. Infantino confirmed that FIFA's revenue from the 2026 World Cup is projected to reach $11 billion, a number that places it among the most profitable sporting events in the history of organized sport. The cities collectively are spending hundreds of millions in preparation. The gap between what FIFA earns and what the cities earn, both financially and in terms of risk, is the structural inequity that the Globe and Mail's reporting has now made visible in a way that contract summaries and press releases never could. FIFA's response to all of this has been broadly that the cities knew what they were getting into, that the economic benefits, tourism, infrastructure investment, global profile, justify the costs, that when cities pushed back on specific demands that were legally impossible, FIFA adapted. These are reasonable points as far as they go. FIFA did soften some of its demands. Cities did have some negotiating power, particularly in Canada, where legal constraints gave municipal governments leverage they might not have had otherwise. But the broader picture, the one that the Globe's investigation has laid bare, is an organization whose contract model was designed in an era when cities would accept almost anything to host the World Cup, and which is now encountering a world where that acceptance is eroding. Chicago said no to the Women's World Cup. Pittsburgh said no. Over a dozen cities dropped out of the 2026 bidding process before the final hosts were selected. The supply of unconditional host city enthusiasm is not infinite, and FIFA, in backing down on its demands in Toronto and Vancouver, has demonstrated something it rarely demonstrates, that it can be moved when pushed hard enough. What does any of this mean for what happens when the football starts? On the pitch, nothing. The matches are played regardless of how the contracts were negotiated. The players don't know the terms of the host city agreements. Mbappe doesn't care about the Vancouver Jazz Festival's August dates. The football will be what the football always is. But the story of this tournament's build-up, The story that will be written about in sports governance journals and in municipal planning departments for years to come is a story about what happens when the most powerful sports organization in the world meets organized institutional resistance. The cities pushed back. FIFA moved. Partially, not completely, but it moved. Only 12 of 16 host cities have published their FIFA-mandated human rights action plans ahead of the tournament. Vancouver only published theirs last week, making it the fourth city to meet the requirement. Toronto has still not published its plan as of this week. These are not minor administrative oversights. They're commitments cities made when they signed their host agreements, now arriving late in circumstances that suggest the oversight of those commitments was not as robust as it should have been. And that's where the pushback story connects to a bigger question that will outlast this tournament. Not whether FIFA's demands were legal, they were. Not whether the cities signed voluntarily, they did. But whether the model that makes FIFA fabulously profitable and remarkably low risk, while governments assume most of the cost, is sustainable. Whether the generation of mayors and city councils and sports ministers who are sitting with the contracts right now will still be willing to sign them for the 2030 World Cup and 2034 and beyond. The pushback is real. It produced results in Toronto and Vancouver. It produced nothing in New Jersey, where the transport costs went unpaid. It produced frustration in Philadelphia, where the canceled hotel reservations hit without warning. The pattern is uneven. The leverage cities have varies enormously depending on their legal frameworks, their alternatives, and how much they want the tournament. But the conversation has changed. And this week's reporting from the Globe, contracts that FIFA doesn't normally make public, obligations that cities didn't fully anticipate, a structural model that concentrates risk in one place and revenue in another, has made that conversation specific, documented, and impossible to dismiss. I'd genuinely like to know what you think about this side of the story, not the football, the governance. Does knowing what those contracts contain change how you think about the World Cup as an institution? Do you think cities will keep signing on the same terms in 2030 and beyond? Or do you think, as the evidence from Chicago, Pittsburgh, and the cities that dropped out of the 2026 bidding process suggests, that something is genuinely shifting in the relationship between FIFA and the world that hosts it?